Nation of Fit and 10, welcome to day 14. It is day 14, and that means we are 20% into this challenge. We are 1/5 through. We have another 4 of these blocks to go through, so you can see how fast it goes. Reminder, your next scan is happening not next week, but the following week. So they'll start in about 12 days or so. Okay, middle of week 4 essentially. So stay tuned for that. Reminder, when you're entering meat, especially red meat, into your eating journal, when you're accounting for it, make sure you specify what kind of meat it is. Because a ribeye versus, say, flank is going to be a whole lot different, or something like that. Okay, so be careful with your choice of meat that you choose to enter into your app, right? It's got to be into your food journal. It's got to accurately represent what you're having. Okay, the same goes for ground meat. A lot of people are just using ground beef. So is it 80, 85, 90, 95% lean? Chances are it's probably 85 to 90, but again, we just want an entry that accurately reflects it. So be as accurate as possible. Also, if you enter something in, you've put this in as your own type of food, please give a description of it. Don't just leave it as blank or as something like entry 1. It needs to be I need to know what it is. I'd like to know what it is, okay? Anything else I want to mention? Oh yes, oatmeal. If you're gonna eat oatmeal, ideally you measure it raw. If you measure it cooked, it's one of those things where it just absorbs water, but if you're using standard amount of water which is usually like, I don't often make it, but I think it's like double the water so if you do like, say, 4 ounces of oatmeal, it's gonna be like 8 ounces of water. You double the water for the amount of oatmeal. I think that should be okay. But yeah, the only downfall with it is that, the more you cook it, the more moisture you lose. So it's not totally accurate. Raw is always better when it comes to oatmeal. All right, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about starch, sugar, and fiber. This all falls within the carbohydrate realm. And I'm going to keep this very simple and short. And so let's do that. There isn't a significant difference, to my knowledge at least, there isn't a significant difference between starch and sugar, with the exception that starch is a chain of sugars. So what happens is, if you have starch, like let's say you have a yam, and you have a sugar, let's use something simple here. Let's use honey. You have essentially individual units of sugar. Perhaps these are disaccharides. They're individual. They're 2 units put together. Starch would be a long chain of sugars. So the difference is the rate at which they're going to get digested, essentially. So broken down and then entering the bloodstream. So what we term as sugar, technically starch is sugar, but starch is obviously a more specific form of carbohydrate. It's chains of sugar. So if you have a starch, it's going to, generally speaking, of course, there is something called glycemic index, which I won't talk about now. If you have a starch, it's going to, in general, starches will break down slower, generally speaking, than sugars. Especially if you have starches that have fiber added to them, and or fats and or protein. Fiber will make a big difference. So if you're eating a real whole food, for example, like the difference between a yam and a white potato, a yam is going to have more fiber. It's going to have a lower glycemic index, which just basically means it's going to have a lower what's the best way to put it? It's going to raise your blood sugar levels slower, okay, the yam will, over the white potato, essentially. But if you have a sugar like honey and you have some other fiber, there's no fiber in honey. There's no fiber, there's no protein, there's no fat. But if you had honey with some fiber and some protein, like let's say you're having it in a shake, for instance, you had it with some fat, with some fiber, and with some protein, then you're definitely slowing down the rate of sugar absorption into the bloodstream. So, just keep this in mind. This is one reason why I don't consider, and you shouldn't consider, fruit, the same as like a chocolate bar. I mean, this should be obvious. But you might argue, you might say, well, or candy or whatever, because chocolate bars tend to have fat. So let's say candy, where we're just getting sugar. You might just say, well, if an apple, it's basically pure sugar. If you look at it, it's just carbohydrates and it's mainly sugar. And a candy, and it's just carbohydrate. What's really the difference? Well, you may already know this, but essentially we're getting a lot of micronutrients, a lot of phytonutrients. We're getting a lot of fiber. We're certainly getting a lot more volume. All right, so those two things are not the same thing. One, you're getting much more nutrition density, and you're also getting some moderators of sugar uptake. One of those being fiber, right? Okay, now what about fiber? I'm almost at 7 minutes. All right, I'll talk about fiber tomorrow. We'll talk about soluble and insoluble fiber tomorrow. Okay, all right, so message of the day on this day 14. You can't find time. You got to make time, essentially. That's the message. You cannot find time. You must make the time. And if you prioritize, and I understand there's only so much you can prioritize, but in this challenge, really, there should be no excuse for not getting in, with the exception of being sick. There should be no reason why you can't get in your 4.5 hours of exercise per week. The 4.5 hours out of the 168 hours that you have. And when it comes to your food, I think a lot of you are realizing that you have to, like I said in the beginning, you got to pre-plan your food in the beginning. You got to pre-plan it out, pre-make it, subdivide it, and have it ready to go. And like I've always suggested, try to ration out your food at each meal. So you're getting an even distribution of macros at each meal. And then by the end of the day, you don't have to worry about trying to get in whatever it is that you're way off on. Okay, and this is, I'm going to start expecting this as we roll into week 3. Okay? All right, positive energy, positive vibes. Believe in yourself, and for the love of God, give some gratitude, and I'll talk to y'all tomorrow.